Please do not adjust your sets. What you are about to hear is not the work of a CBC technician gone mad. It's the sound of a Sasquatch.
Sasquatch, the anthropology of the unknown.
It was under a grove of trees in a place called Kelso Valley in Mojave Desert area, California. And it was just a large, dark, very black object. Trees were absolutely still. The dog that was with us, a big German Shepherd, was scared to death. We didn't realize what it was at the time. Around midnight, we heard three distinct cries, not cries, but it sounded like a bird you might expect to encounter in the Amazon or the African jungle. I didn't even think about this big hulking figure. I thought I was letting myself get spooked. The next morning, I checked over the area 3 different times and could come up with absolutely nothing. So I more or less disregarded it until 1976, when John Green came down. He played a tape recording for me that was made at Puyallup, Washington in 1975, and it was the same bloody sound that we had heard in 1973.
The Anatomy of a Sasquatch is the first of 5 programs based on a rather unusual conference on humanoid monsters held at the University of British Columbia in 1978. It is prepared and narrated by Radio Canada International's Susan Lumsden, who attended the controversial sessions on that elusive Pacific Coast creature known as the Sasquatch, or Bigfoot.
The conference was organized by the university's Museum of Anthropology, and while there were the predictable anthropologists and professors in attendance, they seemed to disappear into their tweeds when compared to the flamboyant Sasquatch hunters striding in and out of the hall in cowboy boots, Stetson hats, and checkered bush jackets. Of the 150 delegates, about half were academics, and the other half divided equally between the hunters and the press. It was, after all, the first conference ever held on the huge ape-like creature that allegedly dwells in the Pacific Coast rainforests in British Columbia and the American states of Washington, Oregon, and California. In this first program, you will hear some of the leading Sasquatch hunters, or active investigators as they preferred to be called, describing their evidence for a Sasquatch. The most avid veteran is Rene de Hinden, a short, weather-beaten, and amiable inhabitant of Richmond, British Columbia. He tells his story now.
I came from Switzerland in October of 1953. I was 23 years old. I was working on a dairy farm in Calgary. And one night, supper time, we were listening to the radio. And there was an announcement that the Daily Mail newspaper in England sponsors an expedition to look for the Yeti in the Himalayas. And I said to the farmer I worked for, wouldn't that be something to take part on a search like this? And he said, well, you don't have to go that far. They got them hairy things over in British Columbia. And of course I thought he was fooling. But this is really the first time I heard of the Sasquatch at the beginning. I thought at the time, I had no experience or qualification or even anything to evaluate anything which was told to me. Somebody said they saw a Sasquatch. Obviously they did. That was all there was to it. And I figured in 56, I go out there, grab him by the tail, and bring him home to mother. You see? Well, this is 22 years later. I'm still running around out there trying to grab one. And of course,
my name is Rich Grumley, and I am the remaining founder of the California Bigfoot organization. First, it was a hobby, and then I guess it became the magnificent obsession. And I've been doing this type of thing for 21 years, research. I have participated in or led slightly in excess of 800 expeditions into the bush on this type of thing. I've been more or less actively engaged in tracking down reports, tracking the creatures, et cetera, for the last 9 years.
At the very beginning, the first 10 years, we knew all about it. I met John Green from Harrison Hot Spring. We knew all about the Sasquatch, the sighting pattern, where they are crossing the road, at what time of the year. Because it was all nonsense. But, you know, we had a little bit of data and we fooled around with it, and bingo, we knew it. Today, we don't know nothing.
And so, piecing two and two together, I came up with the probable answer that what I had seen was not a common, ordinary thing, that it was a Sasquatch. Then on the east side of Lancaster, I saw another one, but it was before this time, in company with two other investigators, and it was just a big, funny-looking figure standing with its feet together, arms outstretched, and head more or less on its shoulders. About 150 yards from us, I motioned to Fred Adams, and when we looked back, it was gone.
It follows that if we are, in fact, compiling information about a real creature, then we cannot make of it whatever might suit our own fancies. It has to be the creature that the witnesses describe.
John Green is from Harrison Hot Springs, a resort town in British Columbia, 60 miles northeast of Vancouver. It was there in the 1920s that the word Sasquatch first entered the language, as an anglicization of the Salish Indian word for the huge forest creature resembling man. A teacher at an Indian reservation nearby began writing newspaper articles on the Sasquatch stories he'd learned from the Indians. The Sasquatch was frequently used as an advertising device for the resort town until 1958, when a full-fledged Sasquatch hunt was staged to celebrate British Columbia's centennial. John Green, then the editor of the local newspaper, became interested in the Sasquatch phenomenon. Today, he is the most respected of the Sasquatch investigators, and his painstaking research has become the subject of several books. He spoke about his findings to the assembled delegates.
Now, we're dealing with reports of something that walks upright like a human, but is entirely covered with hair and is usually much larger than a human. I have no way of knowing how many reports about such creatures there may be, but from North America alone, I have more than 1,000 on file, plus several hundred more concerning footprints of a suitable size and shape for the animal described. Now, with that volume of reports, even allowing for the fact that an unknown number of them are manufactured or mistaken, some validity must be assumed for those attributes and actions that are frequently described. And consideration should also be given to those things that are not described at all. There should be enough information to tell us not only what the creature is, but also what it isn't. The next part of my paper is a digest of some of the points that I think are significant from a careful study of that volume of reports. The first is simply that Sasquatches are significantly larger than humans, and not only in height. The average of all the height estimates is more than 7.5 feet. Perhaps more significant than the height is the heavy build described. Next point, these are solitary creatures. Third point, their hairiness is of an animal rather than a human sort. Fourth point, the proportions of the limbs are more human-like than ape-like. However, the fifth point, from the shoulders up, there is considerably less resemblance to the average human. The shoulders are termed as wide in comparison to those of a human in 90% of descriptions. And 70% refer to the necks as short, and another 25% say no neck at all. Flat faces with large flat noses, sloped foreheads, and heavy brow ridges are noted in nearly all of the descriptions that come from close observations. Sixth, they are omnivorous. Seventh point, they are largely nocturnal. My eighth point is that they are not active in cold weather. Everywhere except in Florida, there are only half as many reports in the winter as there are in the summer and fall. And tracks are rarely found in snow. Now, there's an oddity in this, in that there are also very few reports in the spring, not significantly more than there are in the winter. And consistently, there are less reports in May than there are in April. I have wondered if perhaps that's the mating season. And this has been so throughout. There have been less reports in May than in any other month. Next point is that the Sasquatch make considerable use of water. But almost all of those observations involve substantial numbers of reports. In addition to that, there are a number of observations that seem of probable significance, although they've only been reported a very few times. One is that the only time that Sasquatches have been reported sleeping, to my knowledge, they were out in the open, although it was snowing and there were trees nearby that they could just as easily have been under. Another, which I'm not very happy about, but I have 6 reports of Sasquatches being clocked by people in cars. And the speeds reported were 35 miles an hour, 45 miles an hour, 50 to 60 miles an hour, 60 miles an hour, 70 miles an hour, and 80 miles an hour. However, none of those reports were from west of the Continental Divide. I have 6 reports of Sasquatches shaking or hitting vehicles, 5 of them jumping on vehicles, and 5 of them pushing at or slightly damaging buildings. For those of you who think they're very intelligent, when they try to push a building down, they seem invariably to push it from the corner, which is probably about the worst place. I have 8 reports of Sasquatches seen throwing things at people, but without hitting anyone, and 17 of them chasing people, but without catching anyone. Maybe the people really speed up under those circumstances.
John Green described the North American Sasquatch generally and went on to outline the Russian Sasquatch in finer detail. Yes, 2 Russian scientists, Dr. Dmitry Bayanov and Dr. Boris Porshnev from the Darwin Museum in Moscow, presented papers in absentia. Dr. Porshnev's Sasquatch findings are presented now by John Green.
Their average height is from 5 to 6 feet, but there are great variations in size. The entire body is covered with hair from 3/4 to 3 inches in length, but uneven. For instance, the cheekbones are covered very slightly. There is no underlayer of hair, so that sometimes the skin can be seen. The hair grows longer in cold weather. Infants are born without hair. There is not much hair on the hands and feet, and none on the palms and soles. Hair on the head is usually of a different color from that on the body and noticeably longer. It is sometimes matted and sometimes falls onto the shoulders or even down to the shoulder blades. And there again is a difference. The head leans forward more than a man's and is supported by strong muscles which make the neck appear to be short and wide with the head right on top of the trunk. The back of the head rises to a cone-shaped peak. The forehead is low and receding with prominently protruding eyebrows and eyes deeply buried in the skull. The bridge of the nose is usually flat with the nostrils turned outward. However, the shape of the nose tends to be variable. Cheekbones are wide and protruding. Jaws are heavy, strong, and greatly protruding. The mouth is wide but almost without lips. Teeth are like a man's but larger, with the canines more widely separated. The ears differ little from a man's ears but have longer lobes and are occasionally somewhat pointed at the top. The eyes appear slanted and the face seems sometimes mongoloid, sometimes negroid. Creatures are generally upright, but shoulders are rounded and somewhat stooped or forward-leaning, with arms hanging in front of the body, especially when walking. The legs are usually slightly bent at the knees, as are the arms at the elbows. Their stride is clumsy. When they walk, they sway from side to side as well as front to back with the swing of their arms. Difference in size of the hands and feet is less than in men, and the thumb is less opposed than man's, so that they often grasp objects between the fingers and palm without the thumb. The big toe has independent muscular action, including the ability to turn in opposition to the rest of the foot, and the other toes also are flexible and capable of independent movement. They can squat and sit on their buttocks. They have been seen sleeping in the daytime face downward with knees and elbows drawn in under their stomachs and their hands behind their heads. For their size, they are significantly stronger than men. Breeding pairs remain together, but the males are inclined to range over a wider territory, whereas females tend to remain in one area while their offspring are young. They give birth to single and twin offspring which resemble human babies. They do not have permanent homes, but often find shelter in holes in the ground. The young eventually leave their mothers to find territories of their own. Large, old individuals past the age of breeding live alone in the mountainous and heavily forested regions. Witnesses often report a very distasteful smell. The creatures are capable of many very different sounds and call to each other over long distances, particularly at twilight and dawn. Mooing, mumbling, whining, and whistling are reported, but nothing resembling speech. They do not make any tools, but can throw stones and even carry them and use them to make windbreaks. They may break stones one against another. They do not make fire, but are glad to warm themselves at the embers of a fire that has been abandoned. They may use sticks and clubs. They eat both meat and vegetable foods. They may dig roots. They eat different sprouts and leaves, all kinds of berries, fruits, and nuts. Given opportunity, they will take cultivated vegetables and fruit such as corn, sunflower seeds, hemp. They catch frogs, crabs, turtles, and snails, and will eat frogs' eggs, insects, worms, nestlings, and eggs. They may catch small animals such as gophers, moles, rabbits, and other rodents, and scavenge from the carcasses of larger animals, but they do not hunt large animals themselves. On the few occasions when they kill larger animals, it is by breaking the back. They steal lambs and eat the entire body. It may be that they eat their own dead, since none are ever found. Towards man, they are not usually aggressive. Well, that's the Russian material, and I don't think that any of you will have failed to note that except for the size, there are not very many points of difference between the reports studied by Professor Porshnev in Russia and those that I've been summarizing. And on the other hand, there is exact agreement on some of the specific points. It should be noted, however, that the difference in size alone puts the two creatures in very different relationships to their environment. The Russian creatures are literally man-sized. They're said to be stronger, but not heavier. We are dealing in North America with an animal that, besides being taller, is proportionately bigger in both dimensions. Now, I've given this information from my files in order to draw conclusions about the nature of the animal described. And the Russian information, even though it may refer to a different species, or even a different genus, or a different family, still would generally support most of the same conclusions. One conclusion is that the Sasquatch is not normally a dangerous animal. There is nothing in its record to suggest a species that preys on humans or that tends to attack them for any reason. In fact, if those people who tell of being grabbed or picked up are telling the truth, it is a creature that makes very restrained use of its strength in its infrequent contact with humans. However, there is one thing that should be borne in mind. It is not actually very uncommon for humans to disappear in wild areas. And it would certainly have to allow for the fact that a lone human attacked by a Sasquatch would tend to disappear. My second conclusion is the one where a lot of people are going to disagree, and that is that the relationship between the Sasquatch and Homo sapiens has not been proven to be any closer than that between our own species and the other great apes, except in the shared posture and means of locomotion. I'm not saying that it isn't closer, I'm just saying that I do not find in this record anything to establish such a conclusion. There is nothing to indicate that it is in any way a missing link in our evolution or any kind of a near human being. With the exception of the upright posture and the loss of hair, man's differences from the other primates are mainly in his head. And those differences obviously result from a radical departure a very long time ago from any of the normal primate lifestyles. While all the other species of primates have relied on physical abilities and on instincts to hold a place in a competitive world, man has shifted his reliance to his brain. And somewhere along the line, he learned to increase very greatly the effectiveness of cooperation through verbal communication of ideas. And, you know, this is not a small difference between creatures. This is an absolutely fantastic thing.
John Green's belief that the Sasquatch, when found, will have more to do with apes than men is supported by one of the few academics in the field. Dr. Grover Krantz of the Department of Anthropology, University of Washington, was in the audience, and I asked him if theories of evolution would be revolutionized if the Sasquatch turns out to be man's nearest primate relative.
In a word, no. It will not change our picture of human evolution in any way. I'm sure the newspapers will make the biggest thing, Darwin was right, Darwin was wrong, evolution proved, evolution disproved. It's going to be the most exciting thing that the press has had for a long time. But as far as evolution is concerned, if it is what I think it is, just a surviving Gigantopithecus, it won't change anything.
Why do you think the Sasquatch hasn't been found, and what is required above all in order to find it? Or find some concrete proof of it, like a set of bones, as you were saying?
Well, okay, the pile of bones, or more, is the only thing that the scientific establishment will accept, and I think rightly so, and that's all the public, the overwhelming mass, would accept. Now, the reason why it hasn't been found is quite simply the same reason why any other large, rare animal is not found. People just don't find skeletons of these animals when they die a natural death. The ones we have in the museums, bears, mountain lions, things like that, are almost invariably the ones that were shot or somehow killed by people. And so far, no one has come forward and acknowledged having shot or otherwise killed a Sasquatch. Now, I wouldn't be a bit surprised if somebody has, and I'm hoping that somebody like that will come out of the woodwork now and admit to it, and we can go to the site. If we can find just a few bones, then the mystery is solved forever. Now, I don't think too many people would have shot a Sasquatch simply because it has a human appearance. Even though there's no reason to think there's a shred of humanity mentally in these creatures, the fact that they stand up with two eyes in the front of the head and look at you, it's a very disconcerting thing for people, and most people say that they couldn't shoot one if they saw one.
While the absence of bones and fossil remains is the biggest argument against the existence of the Sasquatch, the case for the Sasquatch is supported by the existence of the giant panda, giant squid, and even the gorilla, which were once considered as imaginary as the Sasquatch, until they were proven by scientists to exist. It was as late as 1928 that the giant panda was finally discovered in China by the sons of American President Theodore Roosevelt. Dr. Grover Krantz continues the story of the discovery of the mythical panda.
That was in southwest China. And for some 20, 30 years or more, it was well known to certain Europeans, that is, they knew the animal was there, but they couldn't produce any proof of it. And it wasn't even in particularly remote areas. There were cities nearby and towns, and the Chinese knew about them. Some of them had seen it, most hadn't. And some Europeans had seen it, yes. And when they were finally brought in, captured, it was quite a bit of a sensation. It was the end of something in excess of a 20-year search, and it turned out that the pandas were not making any effort whatsoever to avoid people. They just climbed their bamboo trees and sit up there still and watch the people go by. Now, the gorilla was a little bit more exciting. This is not the mountain gorilla, but the lowland gorilla. That was first reported to Europeans approximately the year 1600 A.D.
In Africa?
From Africa, and it was pretty much a mythology, and the descriptions were pretty confused, and it wasn't until 1850 that the first skeleton was brought to Europe, 250 years later. And so at that rate, we have reports of the Sasquatch for, I think, just about 150 years. We've got 100 years to go. I hope not.
Another person who hopes the Sasquatch will soon be found is its most avid hunter, Rene de Hinden. He concludes this part of the Sasquatch story.
Basically, John Green and I started this in 1956. We were the basis of it. Yet the big publicity, the big knowledge went out in 1974 when the Smithsonian showed the Smithsonian special, on the Bigfoot Yeti. And then the movies, 74, 75, 76 was this tremendous boom in movies about Bigfoot. And this what sparked it. And of course this then sparked all these other people jumping around and say, I'm going to catch one myself. And the movie industry really did it. It wasn't so much us.
Say tomorrow or next year you find you catch your Sasquatch. How will that change your life?
Somebody told me once, they said it's better to travel than to arrive. What he meant, it's better to strive for something than to arrive there. But that's a sorry thing to say, because I wouldn't want to spend another 22 years scratching my head and wonder if the thing exists. I would like to find it, because finding a Sasquatch is not the end, it's the beginning. Then there will be studies done left, right, forwards and backwards in 10,000 different ways. There will be, I'm not dissecting the Sasquatch, but the whole question of it. Why wasn't it accepted before? Why the sociological resistance against it, psychology behind it? And we're going to be right up over our ears in scientific papers explaining it all to us. And in the meantime, ignoring other mysteries, of course, until they are also proven.
You have been listening to The Anatomy of a Sasquatch, the first of 5 programs based on the Conference on Humanoid Monsters held at the University of British Columbia in 1978. Next, in The Monster Legend, an outline of the importance of monsters from earliest European to modern American civilization. This series on the Sasquatch was narrated and produced by Susan Lumsden with the assistance of Elizabeth James. Technical direction was by Michel Depassier in Montreal for Radio Canada International.